I'd like to start by pointing out that the perpetrators of this crime chose their victims. There were almost innumerable other targets they could have hit.
The place where they were attacked is more than a nightclub. It is a place of solidarity and empowerment where people have come together to raise awareness, to speak their minds, and to advocate for their civil rights.
Obama was preparing to name the Stonewall Inn in New York City as a national monument for gay rights as the shooting took place. Gay clubs are more fundamental to the gay rights movement than black churches were for black people during the civil rights movement. In black churches, black people could find warmth and acceptance that they were denied in white society. But in gay clubs, gay people found the mutual support, warmth, and acceptance that they were denied anywhere else in society, including their churches and families. So I'd like to begin by honoring the lives and the struggle of all people, but in this video especially the struggle of LGBT people, to be who they are, to celebrate who they are. And I'd like to condemn the monsters behind this crime for attacking some of the most vibrant and joyous celebrators of life to be found on the planet. The fact that Bush, not Osama bin Laden, did 9/11 is becoming more and more of a mainstream idea.
Does anybody actually blame my brother for the attacks on 9/11?
No. I would never blame your brother for the 9/11 attacks. No, no, no.
The third airplane goes right
into the Pentagon? I don't think so, bitches. That was a missile. And Tower 7 was brought down by a bomb. Crack a book, sheeple.
Bush did 9/11.
And you know what else? Bush did 9/11 and jet fuel can't melt steel beams.
Bush did 9/11.
And I think the primary lessons we should learn from the 9/11 attacks are that, number one, the idea of radical Islam as a threat to the people of the United States is a fraud. And lesson number two is that the men who cry terror and be afraid and radical Islam at every opportunity are, at the very least, acting in the services of the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks. Like most people, I am, by nature, trusting and even gullible. I don't automatically suspect conspiracies everywhere I look. I believe most of what I read in the newspapers. And as I read the stories about what a monster the Orlando shooter was, how he beat his wife and scared and threatened his friends and co-workers, I just drank it all in. And I wrote this note to myself. He was a stupid asshole freak hater. I thought it was weird that the FBI had opened and closed a file on him 2 different times. But they investigated, they said, and found nothing, so they closed the file. It is weird, but what do you want them to do? They followed him around for a while. They sent undercovers to talk to him and to try to talk him into committing crimes, and they determined correctly, I think, that he was not a jihadi. I mean, he wasn't, so they closed the file. I read that story and swallowed it more or less. It's okay to be gay, unless the FBI needs you to be straight. Let me be honest, I am suspicious of everything. And so I try to keep my eyes open, and very early on, after the stories that Omar Mateen's ex-wife said that he beat her, and that he was unbalanced, a Brazilian news team interviewed the ex-wife and her new husband, who was also Brazilian, and he told them that she suspected that Omar Mateen was gay.
Ele tinha tendências gay.
That his father accused him of being gay.
Ela disse para mim que o pai dele chamou ele de gay várias vezes.
And that the FBI told them not to tell this to the American news media.
Ela dividiu isso com as autoridades ontem, com o FBI?
Com o FBI, só. E o FBI, na verdade, pediu que ela não dissesse isso para a mídia americana.
Wait, what now? The day of the shooting, the FBI was running around immediately and instantaneously trying to squash the story that the shooter was gay? Why? That didn't make sense to me. If the FBI wants to solve the crime, why would they be running around suppressing evidence in the very first hours of their investigation? And if they're not trying to solve the crime, what the frack are they trying to do? And then the dam broke with a flood of witnesses. There were a dozen credible regulars from the Pulse nightclub who said that Omar was a regular there.
I met him one time at the bar. He was talking to me about his ex-wife. He was regular. We consider that regular. Everybody knew his name, Omar. Yeah. He was trying to pick up people, men.
I recognize him from one of the apps.
From a gay dating app?
Yeah, from a gay dating app.
You recognize him from a gay dating
app?
app?
Yeah, I recognize him from Grindr. I recognize him off Grindr. The one of him in the tie. He's been in that venue several times. That's not his first time going there. I know that for a fact. Two of my friends already went to the FBI and they already spoke with them. They already turned in their phones and they already got all the information.
When he was first contacting me, he was saying, asking what club, in his words, what clubs are popping and things of that sort, and what good places are to go.
And here's a couple of reporters talking about their experiences discovering all of these witnesses.
Eventually, we got 4 people on the record saying that they had seen him there. One said at least a dozen times. One person indicated that this had gone on for years, that Mateen had visited these bars. Kevin West, who was saying that Omar Mateen had actually solicited him or asked him out on a date, and that it was a romantic date. They were absolutely certain about it. They didn't volunteer this information to me. I was talking to them. I overheard one of them say it, and I stopped them, and I was like, wait a minute, you're saying you saw him there? And they were like, yeah. Everybody knows that. And I thought, well, no, not everyone does. Right. So we asked police about that, and they told us that they didn't have any information about that, which we were kind of surprised about. We thought that if we were hearing it from witnesses that they might have too.
And the FBI response to all these witnesses coming forward was this announcement. The reporters who wrote this article with this headline didn't buy what the FBI was saying, not one bit, and included in the same article the angry responses of the witnesses. Kevin West, 29, a Navy veteran and Pulse regular, dismissed federal investigators' doubts. No one is lying about him being on there. West said he turned his phone app and passwords over to the FBI investigators. He said the photo Mateen posted on the app matched one of the gunmen released after the shooting. This story is corroborated by another witness.
You recognize him from a gay dating app?
Yeah, I recognize him from Grindr. I recognize him off Grindr. The one of him in the tie.
Cedeno also said, the FBI obviously is trying to cover up. I can go take a lie detector test. I know for a fact Omar messaged me. Cedeno said his friends had their phones taken and were told not to talk to reporters. He said he didn't trust the FBI. They let him go. They let him do this massacre. They could have arrested him. It just does not add up. The English papers also spoke to angry witnesses. Ty Smith said that the story that Omar hated gays was bullcrap, straight up crap. Smith said he'd seen Mateen at Pulse at least a dozen times. He's been around us. He was partying with the people who supposedly drove him to do this. The point here is not that Mateen was gay or wasn't gay or was homophobic or wasn't homophobic. The point is that witnesses are evidence, especially when there are so many and they are so consistent. So this headline is a lie. This statement by the FBI in the article is a lie. And a responsible person has to ask, why is the FBI lying about this? Saying that over a dozen apparently stable, reliable, and mutually corroborating witnesses are not evidence. Why are they trying to suppress evidence, telling witnesses to shut up about it? Why are they lying to reporters?
They told us that they didn't have any information about that, which we were kind of surprised about.
If Omar partied hearty and regularly with gay men at gay venues in a gay fashion, that's a real body slam to the story that he was a radical Islamist, isn't it? And when I see the FBI suppressing this evidence, what I see is the FBI promoting the false narrative that Omar Mateen was a homophobic radical Islamist who murdered gay people out of his twisted Islamic homophobic beliefs. That's not an interpretation. The FBI is promoting a false narrative. That's a fact. When I see this concerted effort at the FBI, at least 4 separate actions, falsely promoting this false narrative, I conclude that it is not an accident, that they keep repeating, and that's just a coincidence. I conclude that they are doing it on purpose, with the purpose of, why would they do that? Why would the FBI want to promote the false story that Omar Mateen was a radical Islamist? Good question, I think, But really, we're just getting started. It's not okay to be nuts, so don't watch Fox News. In the hours after the shooting, there was an attempt to connect Omar Mateen to a so-called radical imam. Note, please, that this is published the day of the shooting. The gunman was a follower of a controversial gang leader who was released from prison last year despite warning from prosecutors that he would recruit people to carry out violent acts, sources told FoxNews.com. Omar Mateen was a radical Muslim who followed Marcus Dwayne Robertson. A law enforcement source said, "It is no coincidence that this happened in Orlando," said a law enforcement source familiar with Robertson's history of recruiting terrorists and inciting violence. Mateen was enrolled in Robertson's online Fundamental Islamic Knowledge Seminary. Robertson and several associates were rounded up for questioning early Sunday, according to law enforcement sources. This is outrageous, isn't it? That the prosecutors wanted this guy locked up specifically to prevent him from doing exactly what he did in Orlando, recruiting people to carry out terrorist acts, and somebody stopped the prosecutors from stopping these killers. And so, under these circumstances, it wasn't insane for Donald Trump to suggest, as he does here, that Obama must be behind the Orlando attacks.
We're led by a man that either is not tough, not smart, or he's got something else in mind. And the something else in mind, people can't believe it. There's something going on.
Right? But let's have a deeper look. You see, this radical Islamic imam immediately began getting death threats based on this story, and he demanded from Fox News and received an opportunity to address the accusations made against him. And the result was this amazing interview.
Do you know the man who was Mateen?
Alhamdulillah, the person known as Omar Mateen, there's been reports saying that he was a student of mine. That's totally not true. He never registered at our school. He never took classes at our school. I don't know him, never met him. Those things are totally unfounded.
Has he never been to your school?
No, never. We're an online institution, so we don't have face-to-face classes, but we do meet all our students online.
So even if he were online, you would know him?
Yes, because we do face-to-faces.
Dan, have you learned anything to the contrary?
To my knowledge, Greta, there is absolutely no evidence that Mr. Mateen was associated with my client, was acquainted with him, was a student of his, or for that matter, ever met him. To the extent that he was a follower of my client, that's completely without our knowledge.
Mateen, why is it people are saying that, do you think? Or not Mateen, I'm sorry, Imam. Imam. Why are people saying that?
There's been a false report. Someone erroneously put it out there that Omar Mateen was a follower of Timbuktu Seminary. I'm the main teacher at Timbuktu Seminary, and people say these things. However, even they went so far to say that I was arrested and my companions were rounded up, and that was untrue either. We haven't had any problems. We've been going on doing business as usual.
So there are two lies that the imam deals with here. The first one being the lie that was in the media immediately after the shooting, that Mateen was a student at the imam's seminary, and the second lie that the imam and members of his school had been rounded up and brought in for questioning. The imam's mere presence at this interview, the fact that he was not rounded up and is not being prosecuted, prove that he's telling the truth in denying all of this. But where did these lies come from? Well, the papers quote some unnamed person from, quote, law enforcement, unquote. But how was law enforcement so ready with these lies? Why did they choose this imam? And how could the liars rely on all the media to just completely swallow their lies without any follow-up? This is critical stuff. There were important decisions being made about what lies to tell and who to blame. These stories about the imam were made up out of thin air. That's a major decision, to decide to implicate an innocent person and tell lies about them that could get them murdered by some of the victims' relatives and that have zero basis in fact. I would argue that such serious judgments would not have been made in a snap in the crazy hours after the shooting. Such important decisions would have taken time and planning, and they would have taken far more time than the time that elapsed between the shooting and when these lies were put out in the media, which implicates the liars in the murders. The facts before us suggest that these complex and risky lies were prepared in advance, and that the liars had to have been part of the plot. Let's also note that these mysterious and unknown sources, the liars, known only as law enforcement, must have been highly placed to be so universally accepted immediately by every media outlet. These were not remarks by Patrolman Joseph Blow, and while we will go into it more in a minute, given the fact that the liars make reference to the imam's release from federal prison due to a finding by the judge in the case of FBI malfeasance, I think that there can be very little doubt that these lies in the news came from the FBI. And we are indebted to Imam Abu Tawbah for bringing us this information. And now a very clear pattern is taking shape, no? Like the FBI attempts to suppress the evidence that Omar was gay, this story also appeared in the press within hours of the shooting. This story was spread by individuals from law enforcement who, like the FBI for example, were accepted as credible without corroboration, without question, without any sort of investigation, despite the highly inflammatory and dangerous nature of these remarks. These dangerous lies were clearly part of a joint effort to promote a false narrative blaming radical Islam for the slaughter of innocent civilians in Orlando. A joint effort to spread a dangerous falsehood. That's a conspiracy, right? It's the sort of thing that might make you doubt anything that you've been told about this story. But don't go nuts. Let's go on. Omar is not who they said. As I mentioned before, I accepted what I read in the papers about this monster, Omar Mateen, that he was a man brimming with rage, that he beat his wife, that he vented his hatred for gays, blacks, women, and Jews. But as you can imagine now, I started to pay more attention to dissenting voices. Not that we should trust Omar's father, but he insisted that his son was not a devout Muslim, pointing out that he did not have a beard and was not particularly devoted to attending the mosque. And of course, there was this habit of his of going to clubs, getting drunk, and hitting on men. So maybe the father is telling the truth about this. And the men Omar hit on at these clubs also do not describe a monster. Chris Callan, a performer at Pulse and other gay clubs in Orlando, said, "He was a nice guy. He was at the bar. He was actually talking with another guy. I turned around. I was in drag. I said hello. He seemed comfortable," Callan said. "As I was on stage, he was standing next to somebody having a conversation, having a good time, close to the stage. Later on that night, he was out there dancing with another guy." Samuel King is also a drag queen in Orlando, and he knew Omar from high school, so there's no question of mistaken identity. He said that Omar visited him at his job where he was performing in drag, and that he did not show any hatred to any of us. He treated us all like the individuals we were. He always smiled and said hello. At the time of the shooting, Omar was employed as a security guard at an expensive senior living gated community called PGA Village. His boss at PGA Village said, "Mateen exhibited no signs he was a threat to co-workers or to the residents he guarded at PGA Village." And the old people Omar guarded, the residents of PGA Village, also had nothing but praise for what a nice person Omar was. Maria Roman recalled a time a year ago when Mateen stopped her and her husband, Edwin, for rolling through a stop sign. The encounter lasted about a minute, Roman said. A pleasant Mateen let the couple go with just a warning. Eleanor Dorsey said, "Whenever I saw him, he was very polite. He was always a gentleman. He left a big impression on her because of his chivalry," she said. "He even helped me with the car once. He was always smiling and just seemed like a very nice, positive person." Wait a minute, what? So little old ladies like psychopathic killers? I mean, who knew? And then I stumbled on this video. Some filmmakers wanted to make a documentary on the efforts to clean up the mess from the massive BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And as it happens, Omar was assigned to guard one section of the beach. And in the dark, unannounced and unexpected, this filmmaker drives up on Omar with a hidden camera, and you be the judge about whether the old ladies were lying about Omar and how he treats people.
Morning.
Good morning. Do you have a badge?
No, I'm actually just wondering what's going on here.
Oh, it's for BP, like the oil spill.
Is there any way that I could talk to any of the people that are out there working?
Like, there's people out here, but they're all scattered all over the place. There's no one really to talk to, like any like supervisor. No one gives a No one gives a shit here. Like, everybody just get out to get paid. They're like hoping for more oil to come out and more people to complain so they'll have the jobs. Because once people get laid off here, it's gonna suck for them. They want more disaster to happen because that's where their money making is.
Yeah. It's all about the money, right?
All about the money. Exactly.
That's British Petroleum he's talking about, by the way, saying they don't care about anything but money. Gee, what a monster to say such things about BP. This guy is a childhood friend of Omar's, who is now in medical school, right? He's a med student, and you would think a very reliable individual.
From what I've heard and read, that anybody who dealt with him as a security officer said he was always kind, quiet, helpful, and not disrespectful or violent in any way, shape, or form.
Did you hear that? Let's repeat it.
From what I've heard and read, that anybody who dealt with him as a security officer said he was always kind, quiet, helpful, and not disrespectful or violent in any way, shape, or form.
And I'm telling you, that's what I found. I didn't filter out these few nice remarks from 1,000 bad ones. This is what I found. What you just saw is practically the only thing out there. So where did all this Omar is a monster stuff come from? The story that he physically abused his ex-wife is very likely true, I think, coming from his ex-wife. And Omar's behavior, as she describes it, is ugly and criminal. But first, it is also explainable by his steroid use, which is what she suggested, and what Omar's med student friend suggested.
So I had heard rumors of Omar, his wife divorcing him because of, I guess, on the grounds of violence or domestic abuse. Around that time, I know this is just speculation, but Omar was a very I guess, prodigious bodybuilder, was in the gym a lot, lifting weights. I believe he did confide in me once that he did use steroids to help, bulk up or gain more muscle mass. And this would probably be about the time, when I was in high school and he was, getting married. I don't know if that was the cause for his domestic violence, but it seems pretty consistent, I guess, with the timeline that he would, have been taking performance-enhancing drugs or steroids, and also at the time, been acting violently towards his wife.
And secondly, this spousal abuse and the steroid use was 7 years ago. Omar was happily married for the last several years with nothing similar to be found anywhere, so that his abuse of his first wife cannot be taken as supporting the portrait of the psychopathic killer we see presented here. But there is also, according to the headlines, a co-worker who says that Omar was unhinged, homophobic, and really, really insanely racist, wishing he could kill all black people, and on and on. What should we think about such statements, such accusations against Omar Mateen? We have already seen the statements by the old women and his best friend suggesting that the story Gilroy tells could not possibly be true. Omar had an older friend at his mosque, Mohammed Malik, who described himself as a mentor to Omar. This mentor said that Omar was not racist, and that it was Omar who was disturbed by the racism of his co-workers. Is this mentor credible? Should we believe him? Or should we suspect that he's protecting Omar? Well, this mentor reported Omar to the FBI in 2014 when Omar told him that he had been watching speeches by the radical terrorist imam Anwar al-Awlaki and found them powerful. And his mentor immediately turned him in to the FBI, which I think makes the mentor credible. He clearly was not protecting Omar when he reported him to the FBI. In my exhaustive examination of this shooting, I have found zero corroboration. No one else, no one who said anything except the opposite about Omar being racist. So we should have a closer look at this story. It comes to us from an ex-cop, Daniel Gilroy. Gilroy worked with Omar at PGA Village, where Eleanor Dorsey and Maria Roman lived. Gilroy, however, says that instead of being charming, polite, and even chivalrous, Omar was an incredibly short-tempered, violent, racist maniac, and that he was always like that, a character trait the little old ladies somehow failed to notice. Gilroy says that he tried to tell his employer about what a dangerous guy he was working with, and, he says, he quit just to get away from Omar. As you can imagine, G4S, the security company that employed Omar Mateen and Daniel Gilroy at the PGA Village came under fierce criticism for not noticing that they were employing and giving a gun to a homicidal maniac. However, their response to Gilroy's statements was twofold. They said they did background checks and did psychological evaluations and found nothing wrong with Omar. Further, they said they could find no record of Gilroy ever having made any complaints. And what they did find was a statement written by Gilroy upon his departure from G4S. He wrote, "Co-workers were good men and women that put in an honest day's work and genuinely liked to work as a team and contribute." That was the sum total of Gilroy's complaints. So, was Gilroy lying then? Or was he lying when he told all the media, and I mean all the media, about what a racist monster Mateen was? Well, the old ladies say he's lying now. Omar's childhood, lifelong friend says that Gilroy is lying now. Omar's mentor at the mosque says that Gilroy is lying now. And in an astonishing twist, it turns out that it is Gilroy who has been charged in the past with being a brutally racist cop for punching and using pepper spray on a skinny 15-year-old girl who had violated curfew. Cops have a tough job, and this girl was very difficult and uncooperative. But Gilroy, a big, strong man, clearly lost his cool and unloaded on this girl. I'm just saying, Gilroy has substantive documented charges against him of being a violently racist cop, and there is no one who accused Omar of being racist or violent in the last 7 years except this guy. So, the news has been shaped, manipulated, distorted to give us the impression that Omar Mateen was a violent, threatening, wife-beating, racist, homophobic, radical Islamic terrorist. All of the media did this in a coordinated fashion. I think the only possible motive for these lies and distortions was to promote people's fear of radical Islamic terror. The events of 9/11 had this same goal. Nothing has changed much. Radical Islamic terror was a lie then, and it is a lie now. FBI agents have helped to lead this effort, suppressing evidence and even lying in order to promote fear of radical Islam. But are these agents loose cannons, or are they following orders from the top? We should see what the FBI director has to say, don't you think? The shooter had an extensive background with the FBI, and the director had a lot to answer for.
Thank you, Sally. Our hearts are broken and ache for the people who were lost in Orlando, those wounded and their families. We are so sorry for your loss and your suffering.
I love the way he looks you dead in the eye. He sounds so sincere.
There are strong indications of radicalization by this killer.
Radicalization? What the hell does that mean, exactly? We'll come back to this.
We first became aware of him in May of 2013. He was working as a contract security guard at a local courthouse, and he made some statements that were inflammatory and contradictory that concerned his coworkers about terrorism. First, he claimed family connections to Al-Qaeda. When this was reported to us, the FBI's Miami office opened a preliminary investigation. And over the next 10 months, we attempted to determine whether he was possibly a terrorist. We then interviewed him twice. He admitted making the statements that his coworkers reported, but explained that he did it in anger because he thought his coworkers were discriminating against him and teasing him because he was Muslim. After 10 months of investigation, we closed the preliminary investigation. We will leave no stone unturned, and we will work all day and all night to understand the path to that terrible night. We're also going to look hard at our own work to see whether there is something we should have done differently. So far, the honest answer is, I don't think so. I don't see anything in reviewing our work that our agents should have done differently, but we'll look at it in an open and honest way and be transparent about it.
And the media took up the idea that if no crime had been committed, there was nothing the FBI could do. Omar scared some coworker who had been mean to him by saying he knew Al-Qaeda. Big deal. But now I'd like you to meet Sheriff Mascara. He tells a rather different story. He says that one day, while at work at the courthouse, a sheriff, also working at the courthouse, said something to Omar, and Omar became very agitated and made a comment that he could have Al-Qaeda kill my employee and his family. If that wasn't bad enough, he followed it up with very disturbing comments about women and Jews, and then went on to say that the Fort Hood shooter was justified in his actions. Comey said,
He claimed family connections to Al-Qaeda.
But the sheriff says Omar didn't talk about Omar's family, he talked about killing the sheriff's family. Obviously, Sheriff Mascara felt that this was a big deal if he's going out on a limb like this. If the sheriff's story is true, Comey is a liar of monumental proportions, hiding the fact that Omar's co-worker was an on-duty sheriff's deputy, hiding the fact that Omar had threatened the lives of a sheriff and his family, and giving the very false impression that Omar had committed no crime, so there was nothing they could do. But since 9/11, laws have been passed making it a felony to threaten to murder a sheriff and his family, punishable by 10 to 25 years in prison. Omar confessed to the crime.
He admitted making the statements that his co-workers reported.
So there's really no issue about whether the sheriff is telling the truth. And if the FBI had prosecuted Omar for his outrageous violation of the law, it would have been a short trial. So how did Omar not get prosecuted? How did he not get fired or even demoted or even reprimanded? He didn't get counseled. If the sheriffs were to blame for this felony, for teasing Omar, why didn't they get counseled, reprimanded, or demoted? Something smells bad here. I stumbled on this story about the sheriff in the local paper where Omar lived. They must have gotten it wrong, don't you think? But the New York Times confirmed the story. So one of these guys is lying. The sheriff is telling a story that can only get him in all kinds of hot water with the FBI. He has nothing to gain and everything to lose. And if this story is true, Comey certainly has every reason to lie. But Comey's calling a sheriff,
his co-workers,
or calling a threat to kill the sheriff's family,
family connections to Al-Qaeda,
is not the worst. What is criminal is his claim.
I don't see anything in reviewing our work that our agents should have done differently.
Why wasn't Omar prosecuted? You can scarcely appreciate how easy this case would have been for the prosecutor to persuade a jury that Omar was a terrorist and needed to be locked up. 1. Omar had a publicly declared affinity for Al-Qaeda. 2. He had been to Mecca twice. What the frack? Who goes to Mecca twice? He must have been super devout, eh? 3. Omar had been documented as being in contact with a recruiter for Al-Qaeda. This recruiter eventually blew himself up, together with a bunch of civilians at a restaurant in Syria. But before that, this bomber went to Omar's mosque and tried to recruit others. He knew and spoke to Omar. This is incredibly suspicious. 4. Omar had recently listened to and was moved by videos by Anwar al-Awlaki, a true preacher of Islamic terror. 5. Omar made this felony threat against a law enforcement officer. 6. To which he had already confessed. It would have been easy to convince a jury that Omar was a terrorist. And Omar committed this felony while on the job, but he wasn't disciplined in any way. In fact, as a reward, apparently, for threatening to have Al-Qaeda kill an on-duty sheriff and his family, he was given a zero-stress job working at the lovely PGA Village. What's wrong with this picture? I'm afraid I have a very short list of possible explanations. Perhaps the FBI was protecting Omar.
After 10 months of investigation, we closed the preliminary investigation.
Because he was an asset. That is, he was working undercover for the FBI, and so the FBI protected him. Or perhaps he was an asset, working for several intelligence agencies, and so the FBI protected him. The reason he didn't seem like a criminal to anyone who knew him was because he wasn't a criminal. He was trying to be a good guy, an anti-terrorist hero. This explains everything. He had all these earmarks of a terrorist because he had been working as an asset for the intelligence services for the last 10 years, impersonating a potential terrorist. He had been groomed to appear to be a terrorist. You may have noticed that Omar liked taking pictures of himself as a cop. His friends from high school said that in high school he wanted to be a cop. In high school, he went on ride-alongs with the police. Straight out of high school, the state of Florida hired him to work as a prison guard. He got very good evaluations, but left to go to work for G4S, the world's largest security firm that has government contracts to work Guantanamo Bay prison. At 19, while doing all this, he got a degree in criminal justice technology, and he was working for G4S 10 years later, at the time of the shooting, at PGA Village where the old ladies loved him. You know, it's kind of funny that Comey didn't mention any of this in order to explain why the FBI decided Omar wasn't a terrorist, isn't it? It is. These are all things that, 1, the FBI surely knew about, and that 2, would have influenced their decision that they should close the file, and that 3, would have helped us, Comey's audience, to understand and even sympathize with that decision to close the file. But he didn't mention any of them. Duh, because they would help us see what's really going on. I think this is a key point. Comey is not trying to help us understand why the FBI closed Omar Mateen's file and took him off the watch list. He's lying. And the principal mission is to misinform, lead astray, and bamboozle. Okay, a couple of other quick points. Muslim students who are from the countries that are home to radical Islam, who are attending community college police training classes, would be ideal candidates for use as operatives. Suppose you work for Homeland Security, or the CIA, or the FBI, or whatever, and your job is to find guys like this who want to recruit Muslim Americans to commit acts of terror against the United States. How are you going to do it? How are you going to catch these bad guys? You need bait, right? You need to find some patriotic Muslims, preferably bilingual. You send them to Mecca, maybe even twice, just for example, to see if anyone tries to recruit them. You can also use your assets to test others. For example, you send them into the courthouse and have them say something dangerous to someone in law enforcement to see if it gets reported. You send them into a mosque and have them say they've been watching terrorist recruiting videos to see if anyone reports it. Working for G4S would be the ideal job for such an asset. As a contract security guard, all assignments are temporary. One day you're doing security on an empty beach, the next day you're at the courthouse for 8 hours, or at a retirement community. And if you've gone on a mission for a day or a week or a month, no one misses you because you've always been temporary. Maybe Omar was not such an asset, but damn, that would certainly explain a lot. The Fort Hood shooter and the New York City bomber, the so-called Chelsea bomber, fit this profile. Let's just take a minute to note that the New York City bomber was taking criminal justice classes in community college and then suddenly started traveling to Pakistan and Afghanistan, rubbing shoulders with radical Islamists. The Fort Hood shooter was a U.S. Army major. He studied radical Islam as his duty assignment for the military. I think if you're an Army major, that automatically makes you an asset of the military, duh. And, say his neighbors, he was the nicest guy you'd ever want to meet.
Pleasant, easygoing guy. Never give anybody trouble. He'd always say hi, bye, you know. And you ask him how he was doing, he'd always tell you he was blessed. And, you know, he was a good guy.
It is routine for assets to be blamed for terrorist acts committed by U.S. intelligence agencies. It is no secret that virtually all the people we now call terrorists once worked for the CIA.
The people we're fighting today, we were supporting in the fight against the Soviets.
She is saying that the U.S. created Osama bin Laden. That is, the CIA recruited him to help during their war against Russia in Afghanistan. Bush then blamed him for 9/11, which of course he had nothing to do with, and which bin Laden condemned since the slaughter of innocent non-combatants is against Islam. The blind sheikh, Omar Abdel Rahman, worked for the CIA fighting the Russians in Afghanistan and was then set up to take the blame for the first World Trade Center bombing. The Imam Tauba filed court documents stating that he was working for the CIA and the FBI and that they wanted him to murder Americans. He refused, and so they went after him, called him a terrorist, and put him in prison. The judge, however, in the case agreed with the imam that there was no evidence that he was involved in terrorism and let him go. You should be asking then at this point, how was it that such a nice guy as Omar committed such terrible crimes? And I want to get to that, But I'm still focused on who controlled Omar, and I feel like we're just getting started. Comey is a liar and misinformer of monstrous proportions. Continued. He's not just covering his ass, he's implicated. For example, I mentioned that Omar was documented as being in contact with a terrorist recruiter. This guy, to be exact. Moner Mohammed Abu Salha. Briefly, Moner was a jovial and easygoing young man who somehow recruited himself into the U.S.-supported terrorist group al-Nusra Front. Moner says he flew into Turkey with $20 in his pocket. And by a miracle of Allah, he says, he was able to hook up with all the CIA-connected terrorists he needed to launch a terrorist attack against the lawfully, democratically elected but CIA-hated government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. But before blowing himself up in a restaurant full of innocent civilians, he flew back to the United States, back to St. Lucie, Florida, back to the mosque and to the young men he had grown up with to try to recruit them to join him. And 2 of the young men he tried to recruit contacted the FBI, who then did nothing? The FBI, in cooperation with the same intelligence agencies who carried out the 9/11 attacks, protected Moner from interference until he was out of the country. Other agencies then helped him on his way once he was out of the country. But the FBI protected Moner while he was here. This is central, I think. If you can grasp the meaning of this obvious fact, you will have gained a major insight into what terrorism really is. Now, meet Mohammed Malik. He was offended by Donald Trump saying,
the Muslim communities, they have to cooperate with law enforcement and turn in the people who they know are bad. And they know it. They know what's going on. They know that he was bad. They knew the people in San Bernardino were bad. But you know what? They didn't turn them in. And we had death and destruction.
Mohammed Malik wrote this article for the Washington Post, and its contents are verified by the Washington Post, saying that he called the FBI with an offer of help and told them what he knew about Moner Abu Salha. He didn't know much, but he was anxious to help. The point I'd like to focus on is that the FBI did not contact him. He called them after Moner blew himself up. Malik says that when he heard that Moner supposedly had self-radicalized by watching Anwar al-Awlaki videos, he started going around asking members of his mosque if they had ever watched any such videos. He says he asked Omar, and, quote, Omar told me he had been watching videos of al-Awlaki too. He told me that the videos were very powerful. Malik is a native speaker. We can rely on his proper use of English. And this sounds near present tense. He told me he had been watching videos of al-Awlaki, not he told me that 7 years ago he had watched these videos. He might have been watching them that same afternoon. After speaking with Omar, I contacted the FBI to let them know that Omar had been watching al-Awlaki tapes. Again, he doesn't say, I contacted the FBI to let them know that Omar had once, 7 years ago, watched al-Awlaki tapes. He gives every indication that this is present tense, and he concludes he hadn't committed any acts of violence and wasn't planning any as far as I knew, and I thought he probably wouldn't because he didn't fit the profile. He already had a second wife and a son, but it was something agents should keep their eyes on. I never heard from the FBI about Omar again, but apparently they did their job. Now, watch the footnote about al-Awlaki if you doubt it, but no one can watch an al-Awlaki video without immediately drawing the attention of the FBI, the DIA, the CIA, Homeland Security, and all the rest of those guys. If there is any website on the planet where you can be sure to pick up a cookie that will track you for the rest of your life and hand the results to U.S. intelligence, it is this guy's website. Malik called the FBI and told them Omar had been watching al-Awlaki videos, and he relied upon the FBI to take it from there. The FBI had closed Omar's file 2 months before. I can't believe I'm saying that. The FBI closed Omar's file and took him off the watch list, and 2 months later they had to reopen it because Omar had demonstrable links to an al-Qaeda recruiter/suicide bomber and had been watching al-Awlaki videos, which, as I say, I am sure that the FBI already knew before Malik reported it. And Comey says this.
In the course of that investigation, one witness told us when asked, do you know anybody else who might be radicalizing, that he had once been concerned about the killer because the killer had mentioned Alaki videos.
Well, that by itself has two serious lies. First,
that he had once been concerned about the killer.
Malik had not once been concerned. In fact, he wasn't concerned at all until after he had already spoken to the FBI about Moner. And then, after his initial contact with the FBI, he spoke to Omar. And then Malik found out that Omar had been watching Alaki videos. Malik was currently, in the immediate present, concerned, and so he called the FBI and reported it immediately. Second,
because the killer had mentioned Alaki videos.
Malik didn't say that Omar had mentioned Alaki videos. He said that he had been watching them, and he said that Omar found them to be powerful. Not powerfully offensive or powerfully horrible, but powerful. Saying
the killer had mentioned Alaki videos
doesn't come close to the truth of saying the killer had been watching Alaki videos and found them powerful.
The witness had concluded that he later got married and had a child and got a job as a security guard, and so he was no longer concerned about him.
And that is utter bullshit. It's the worst kind of lie. Omar's video watching did not come before his marriage and the birth of his child. Malik had only just learned about it and was concerned in the immediate present. And that's why he called the FBI. For Comey to say
he was no longer concerned about him
is a solid lie. Malik does say he thought Omar didn't fit the profile. He already had a second wife and a son. But Malik is smart enough to know that he's not qualified to judge who fits the profile and who doesn't. He knew Moner didn't fit the profile. The couple, who according to the official lie did the San Bernardino shooting, like Omar, were married and had a young child. So what the frack is the profile anyway? Malik knew that he did not have the FBI's knowledge and resources. Malik didn't know that Omar had threatened to have Al-Qaeda kill a sheriff and his family, for example. So he happily hands over responsibility to the FBI because he felt that it was something the agents should keep their eyes on. Meanwhile, Comey pretends that it is Malik who is the expert, that the FBI relies upon Malik for deciding who is a threat and who isn't.
He was no longer concerned about him.
And that's Comey's last word on the subject of Omar watching and liking Alaki videos. They did no investigation at all, it seems.
Our investigation again turned and interviewed the killer to find out whether he had any significant contacts with the suicide bomber for al-Nusra, determined that he did not.
Right? They asked Omar, and he said, no, I'm not radicalized. Case closed.
And then the inquiry continued, focusing on the suicide bomber with no further focus on the Orlando killer.
What the fuck? The inquiry continued, focusing on the suicide bomber, who was now in 10,000 little pieces 6,000 miles away in Syria. By all means, let's investigate this guy who is literally smoke, and ignore the guy who threatened to have Al-Qaeda kill a sheriff, who was connected to the Al-Qaeda suicide bomber, and who watched and liked Al-Laki videos. How does that make any sense, right? They ignored the suicide bomber when young men at the mosque reported that he was trying to recruit them. They ignored him as he got on a plane and flew back to Syria to commit acts of terror. But now that he's dead, 6,000 miles away and dead, now they are going to focus on him, to the exclusion of doing anything that might make sense. And since Omar said that he didn't have any significant contacts with the bomber, and since Malik said that he didn't think Omar fit the profile, because of that, they took Omar off the watch list. Really? I've got just one question for Comey. Does he want a cigarette before we put him up against the wall? He's lying. He's protecting the men who sent Moner off to blow up innocent civilians in Syria. He's protecting the men who told him to close the file on Omar and to take him off the watch list so that he could murder 50 people in Orlando, and he's implicated. So who did it? I would first like to present a few introductory points to get us grounded, hopefully on the same planet. Number one, I think that to understand terror in general, it is crucial to understand that virtually all terror, with few exceptions, is a continuation of the fraud of 9/11. The most fundamental lie told by the perpetrators of 9/11 is that radical Islamists want to kill us all And we need to triple the defense budget, make war on peaceful people, and cut taxes for billionaires. You have to keep 2 feet planted on that fact in analyzing any so-called terrorist attack, says me. Attacks on civilians always serve the purposes and goals of the national security industrial complex. What can any group hope to accomplish by the brutal slaying of civilians instead of hitting military targets? The entire world is outraged at such crimes, and of course the fellow countrymen of those killed are the most outraged and the most motivated for revenge and the most willing to see their tax money spent to get revenge. Why would ISIS or ISIL or Al-Qaeda or Al-Nusra or the Girl Scouts want to provoke the people of the United States into spending more trillions of dollars to slaughter thousands of Arab citizens in retaliation? Well, they wouldn't want to do that, of course. But the men who sell the weapons to the military, of course they would. And they are the only ones with any kind of motive, the only ones who gain anything from such attacks. And they are, by the way, the guys who killed JFK. An observation. As a G4S security guard, Omar Mateen had access to many much more relevant targets than the Pulse nightclub. So, let's observe that Omar could easily have attacked representatives of the government. He could have attacked the courthouse where he worked, for example, or the offices of his employer, G4S. G4S provides guards not only for the U.S. prison at Guantanamo, but for prisons in Israel as well. Or he could have attacked the police academy, where he applied, and so on. While he was shooting up his friends at the Pulse nightclub, we are told Omar stopped for a moment to call 911 to complain about the U.S. military bombings of people in Afghanistan and Syria. But Omar hit civilian targets because the goal of this attack obviously was to incite fear and hatred of Islam. Since virtually all radical Islamic terror attacks are false flags and are virtually never carried out by radical Islamists, there is no such thing as a profile for a radical Islamist. Really, that is not an argument. It is a patently obvious observation. The Chelsea bomber in New York City, like Omar, was taking classes in police science in a community college. Is that the profile? The Boston bombers were connected in several ways to the CIA, but were not in the least devout or in any way connected to Islamists of any flavor, radical, passive, chocolate, or strawberry. But somehow the Boston bombing is repeatedly cited as an example of radical Islamic terror. The couple blamed for the San Bernardino shooting absolutely did not do the shooting and had no ties of any kind to radical Islam. They had a young baby. They supposedly shot up a room full of low-level, sincere public servants, friends of the husband, friends who had given them a baby shower, and just minutes before the shooting had given the husband an award for a job well done. What profile did they match? The Fort Hood shooter was a U.S. Army major. He had contacts with radical Islamists, but these contacts were clearly carried out under orders from the U.S. military. It is not possible, it is not conceivable that he was not an operative of the intelligence services.
Pleasant, easygoing guy. You ask him how he was doing, he's always tell you he was blessed, and he was a good guy.
What profile does he match? But how is it accomplished? How do the dark operatives of the national security industrial complex accomplish this? I'm not a crazy conspiracy theorist. I believe all the evidence presented so far is the best evidence available from the most reliable sources. Omar fired shots. People died. But he was also a sweet, quiet guy with aspirations to contribute to the peace and security of the United States. How did these guys get that guy to do those things? The CIA has been studying mind control at this house of torture in Canada and at Stanford University for what is now over 70 years. Not everyone can be hypnotized, but a person under hypnosis will follow virtually any command, no matter how ridiculous, no matter how contrary to their normal behavior. These subjects were men I witnessed who had been told that their butts were stuck to the seat and they could only free them by waving their tongues around in the air. Jesse Ventura did an excellent segment, This young man was programmed to limp.
What are you limping for? Why are you limping?
I'm not limping.
Really?
Yeah.
The programming took less than a minute, and the subject had no memory of what he did while under the effects of hypnosis. The actions of all these killers were completely and utterly contrary to what anyone who knew them might have expected. Two of them, as I mentioned, had been taking classes in law enforcement, from which, says me, they were recruited to special operations for Homeland Security. They were sent out of the country and otherwise groomed to look like terrorists, and then programmed to murder. If some nut who has never shown any interest in extremist politics goes into a gay club where he has gone 50 times before and shoots 50 of his friends and says he's doing it for Hillary and Trump because both are being treated unfairly by the media, that doesn't make him a radical. It makes him nuts. If this person says he is shooting up his friends for Biggie and Tupac, he's not a radical fan of rap music, he's a nut. If he says he's doing it for the Pope, and for the Dalai Lama, and for the Ayatollah, and for the Easter Bunny, that doesn't make him a radical religious enthusiast, it makes him a nut. According to Comey himself, there is not a shred of real evidence connecting Omar to radical Islam.
And he made some statements that were inflammatory and contradictory. First, he claimed family connections to Al-Qaeda. He also said that he was a member of Hezbollah, which is a Shia terrorist organization that is a bitter enemy of the so-called Islamic State, ISIL.
The FBI determined that Omar's views were not radical. Instead, the FBI found that Omar's views were a nonsensical hodgepodge thrown together casually and carelessly to scare the deputy sheriffs he worked with.
After 10 months of investigation, we closed the preliminary investigation.
This was not a snap judgment. The FBI spent 10 months making that determination, and during Omar's phone calls to the 9/11 operator, Comey says Omar gave the FBI no reason to change their minds.
He made 911 calls from the club during the attack. During the calls, he said he was doing this for the leader of ISIL, who he named and pledged loyalty to, but he also appeared to claim solidarity with the perpetrators of the Boston Marathon bombing and solidarity with a Florida man who died as a suicide bomber in Syria for Al-Nusra Front, a group in conflict with the so-called Islamic State. The bombers at the Boston Marathon and the suicide bomber from Florida were not inspired by ISIL, which adds a little bit to the confusion about his motives.
A little bit? No shit, no shit, FBI Director Comey. In addition, a dozen witnesses say Omar drank and chased men and loved cops. He wanted to be a cop. He studied to be a cop. He became a cop. There was literally nothing radical Islamic about him. So this attack wasn't radical or Islamic. It was insane. And that's what Comey should have said, right? If he were just trying to cover his ass, he could have told the truth. He should have told the truth and said, we closed the file on this guy because we were looking for radical Islamists, and he was not a radical Islamist. This attack was not a radical Islamic attack. It was an insane act of a total nut job. So, where does Comey get off saying things like,
there are strong indications of radicalization by this killer?
There were not strong indications. There were zero indications. In fact, there were a mountain of counter-indications. Omar's police connections and homosexuality, for example. Comey saying
there are strong indications of radicalization
is code for calling him a radical Islamist. And when Comey says,
we hope that our fellow Americans will not let fear become disabling, because that is what these savages want.
He is deliberately lumping Omar together with all the CIA-recruited, trained, armed, and protected savages in ISIS in Syria and Iraq. Comey wants to help terrorize Americans into fearing this U.S. intelligence-created boogeyman of radical Islam here in the United States. With this deception, Comey lands with both feet on the side of those FBI agents trying to silence the story of Omar's gay habits. He is lined up with the agents lying to the media about the imam training Omar to be a radical Islamist, and with those telling the ex-cop to fabricate lies about Omar being a racist maniac. More importantly, this strategy of Comey's of ignoring the facts and instead promoting the myth of radical Islam is the strategy and the ideology of the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks. We don't care that Afghanistan had nothing to do with the attacks. We don't care that Saddam had nothing to do with the attacks. The facts don't matter. Muslims are all the same. They are all radical. They all want to kill us. We must not let these savages win. We must make war on them all, and triple the defense budget, and lower taxes for billionaires. It's a subtle point, but it's important and even central, I think, to notice that Omar's nonsensical hodgepodge of radical Islamist ideology, lumping together all Islamists, even the ones fighting each other, is not shared by any other believer in Islam, but it is shared by Comey and the CIA and Homeland Security and Bush and Cheney and Giuliani, by the national security industrial complex. So when Obama and Hillary preach fear of radical Islam and tax cuts for billionaires, that puts them in league with the killers. Oh wait, that's not them. And Hillary didn't do 9/11. That was Rudy and his boys. She didn't do Benghazi. That was Romney and Rove and their boys. Donald Trump brought Giuliani onto his staff and onto the convention main stage, Mr. False Flag Terror himself.
Our enemy is Islamic extremist terrorism. I said Islamic extremist terrorism. The only person who couldn't figure out this was an Islamic terrorist extremist attack was Barack Obama. The terrorists who are killing us and our allies and come here and kill us. And Donald Trump is the agent of change.
Well, you know, Rudy, you make it sound like Donald Trump is the agent of the same old shit.
ISIS has spread across the region and the entire world. Death, destruction, terrorism, the barbarians of ISIS, brutal Islamic terrorism. Islamic radicals at the World Trade Center, at an office party in San Bernardino, at the Boston Marathon, and many, many other locations. In Orlando, Florida, an Islamic terrorist. A hateful foreign ideology, stamping out Islamic terrorism, terrorism, violence, and mass lawlessness. We will completely rebuild our depleted military.
Smells like Donald Trump is the agent of more 9/11 type false flag terror, blaming Islam for the crimes of the national security industrial complex. I like to put footnotes. I want to put footnotes. I'm going to put footnotes, but right now I'm out of time. I'm trying to get this out before the election. Peace out.